40 plus years of storage has preserved this old school rear engine dragster pretty well, and it has some neat tricks from back in the day, including a John Lingenfelter destroked small block Chevy, a very unusual rear end combination for a dragster, and a bunch of other cool stuff that makes this car a true time capsule from 1980. This car popped up for sale in Ohio on Facebook Marketplace, but it was originally built in Grafton, North Dakota by Lee Kieley. He and his wife Connie traveled the United States touring this car in 1980, but they also raced in other years and other classes with other cars, but this car is the one that they traveled with the most. They spent a lot of money to make this car competitive in a class called Econo Dragster. So originally this Econo Dragster class, this came out in the early 70s, and it was a way for old front engine dragsters to be used again, because the rear engine dragsters were phasing out the old cars, and it left a lot of old chassis just kind of laying dormant, and people started using these things. They'd put a single carbureted small block Chevy or big block Chevy, and they'd go out there and be competitive again. Granted, these Econo cars were pretty slow at first. They didn't have a lot of technology as far as the torque converter or anything like that. There was a lot of innovation that happened in the first 10 years of this class. And the car we're looking at today was part of that innovation, because it has some very trick components on it, including a John Lingenfelter D-stroke small block Chevrolet. So in the C category of the Econo Dragster class, you were only allowed to run a small block engine, you could only run a single 4-barrel carburetor, you could only run an automatic transmission. So you were pretty limited on your combinations, but that left a lot of options open for guys like John Lingenfelter to go absolutely crazy to squeeze every ounce of horsepower out of these limited combinations. So that's exactly what happened with this car. Lee Kieley built this thing, and he had John Lingenfelter build him a 309 cubic inch small block Chevy. We'll see that it's got double hump heads on it, and in this listing they've actually pulled one of the Moroso valve covers off, and you can see that it's got Crane gold roller rockers, and you can see by the amount those springs are compressed, this thing's got a big old cam in it. It's got stud girdles, this thing has a big single plane intake, a Holley 4-barrel carburetor, and this thing has a top-of-the-line ignition system on it. It's got an MSD distributor back here, and then a crank trigger system running off of the crankshaft. But this Econo Dragster class really inspired a lot of these tricks that we see as normal equipment nowadays. So there was Econo Dragster and Econo Altered, and they were split up in different categories based on the weight of the car versus the cubic inches, and that's where a lot of these smaller cubic inch combinations came about, because you could run a really lightweight car. So at 309 cubic inches, this car was a featherweight. You can see on a lot of these Econo Dragsters, they didn't run huge slicks. They didn't run a wing on the back. They didn't run much of a wing on the front. They were not going for downforce. They were not going for ultimate traction. They were going for aerodynamics and lightweight. And that's why you'll see a lot of these Econo Dragsters that are extra narrow. You'll see the rear end in this car is super narrow. And that brings us to another point. This car has a Schiefer quick change rear end in it, which is very unusual. It's not something you're going to see very often at the back of a dragster, but this would allow them to really dial in the gear ratios, and it was a special piece that was made for drag racing. This was not a dirt track rear end that somebody mated to a dragster. This was a specially made piece, and it was part of the innovation in the late 70s and early 80s. So in 1980, Connie and Lee Kieley toured all over the country with this car. I've seen pictures of this car at Pomona, at Tucson, Arizona, Bandimere Speedway, U.S. Nationals in Indy, Great Lakes Dragway. This thing raced everywhere. And that was a big task for them because they lived in North Dakota. So just for a quick reference here, from Grafton, North Dakota to Tucson was 1,800 miles each way. To Pomona, 1,800 miles each way. To Bandimere, 1,000 miles each way. Indy, 1,000 miles each way. So for this team to be competitive in the NHRA ranks in Competition Eliminator, it was expensive. They had to travel all over the place. They had to tow this car to all these different tracks and go out there and turn it hard, because this 309 cubic inch combination was a screamer, and there's no telling what gear ratio they were running to make this thing as efficient as possible and get through the traps at the absolute max effort. So even though these cars were by no means as quick as the top dragsters or top fuel dragsters, they were still entertaining to watch because of the RPMs, because of the wild combinations. And to be perfectly honest, the comp eliminator class in NHRA is confusing. Even if you've been around drag racing your whole life, competition eliminator is full of very strict rules. But if you go to an NHRA race today, you'll still see some really obscure combinations in comp eliminator. It's really fascinating to watch. Even though these cars aren't on the main stage with the pro cars, they're still very innovative and extremely expensive to build. So when I saw this car pop up for sale, it was listed for $5,000, which is an extremely fair price when you consider that the John Lingenfelter engine probably cost a lot more than that in 1980. And there was a lot of innovation otherwise in this car. And when you really think about the amount of money that Lee and Connie spent traveling the United States with this thing, $5,000 seems like a really good deal. And personally, to own a John Lingenfelter small block with a bunch of really cool parts in it, that's worth the price of admission right there. So this is a really neat piece. You'll see that it is very complete. Nothing's been robbed off of this car. It's still got its original gauges. It's still got the original Super Trick wheels on the front and the back. Now this car originally did have laced up wire wheels on the front. It later got switched to the spindle mount Super Tricks. And then you'll see it's got the smaller slicks on the back than your conventional dragster slicks. Those are original to the car. You can see that it's got a lot of good pieces still in place here. Now this car has not run in many, many years, but the engine turns over freely, and I am confident that you could do a little bit of work here and there and make this thing fire up again. Now, another change that happened on this car in the short time that the Kieleys ran it is they updated the roll cage. So originally this car had a small 4-point roll bar in it, and they upgraded that to a 6-point by adding an extra hoop in there. And you'll see some different pictures here with the two different configurations. A really cool newspaper clipping I was able to find is from September of 1982, and Lee had this car listed for sale in the local newspaper. And it says that this is the quickest comp car in North Dakota. It lists that John Lingenfelter 309 cubic inch combination, the Schiefer quick change rear end. All the pieces are lining up here. This is the car, and this car is likely unaltered from this exact combination that he lists in 1982. This car is a great example of an untouched C Econo Dragster from back in the day. 45 plus years ago, this car was blasting down the quarter mile, and now it's not, and it needs a new home. So I'm hoping somebody somewhere will pick this thing up, freshen up the old John Lingenfelter engine, and put it back at least to where you can fire the thing up again. Now you can see where the paint has been stripped off of it. It's just bare metal. This car used to have a colorful paint job on it, but all of that's gone, unfortunately, because that really would have tied everything together. And the guy who's selling it luckily has a lot of information from the previous owner to back up a lot of these claims. So it's a really neat piece. I really liked it because it's a unique rear engine dragster. I'll be the first to admit that rear engine dragsters are boring because they're so common and they're so predictable. But back in the day, in the late 70s and early 80s, these things were still innovative. They were still coming up with new ideas. And this car is a great example of that.